For today's procedure exercise, we're going to show you how to take off the crank set, retension the chain, and make the associated adjustments on the rear wheel. Okay, to do an install of the crank set and adjust the chain tension, we need the following tools. Grease to grease the thread of the main axle bolt and for the thread of the pedal. We use a really high quality lithium grease, but most bicycle greases will do just fine. A torque wrench to check the tension on our main axle nut, an 8mm T-section hex key, a 5mm section hex key, a 15mm preferably ratchet spanner. I prefer to use these because they're really easy to get fine adjustments on. Optionally, you can use a 10mm spanner on the gear actuator, but I prefer really just to use the Allen key. There's two kinds of pedal wrenches that you can get. One's just a straight pull one like so. These are okay, but I prefer to use an angled pedal spanner or pedal wrench. Just gives you a firmer grip on the pedal itself. A ruler just to check the tension on the chain, and the most important part of this, or the most unique tool in it, which you probably haven't got in your kit, is a crank puller. This is really common in the bicycle industry. It's designed to remove the crank from the bottom bracket shaft. Show you how to use that later. And just a simple piece of wooden wedge. You'll see again what that's used for shortly. And one more item, rubber mallet. So the next step is to remove the gear actuator, which is this device here. And what this does is it actually pushes on the push rod and then changes the gears inside the hub. So it's very simple to remove. You can either use a 5mm hex key or a 10mm spanner. And just remove that, push it to one side, but be careful not to lose the push rod that's inside the gear. Okay, so the next step, once we remove the actuator, is to loosen off the 15mm nuts on both sides of the bike. So they're both 15mm on both sides, and it's just a matter of loosening it off on one side and loosening it off on the other. Once it's loose enough just to move around a bit, that's fine, you don't have to remove the nuts. Just got a bit of movement there. We can then move the wheel slightly forward and take the chain off. So that now the chain's completely loose, and we can begin the next exercise, which is to remove the crankset. So the next step is to remove the crankset, and that's going to require a couple of unique tools, or one unique tool at least, and that is what we call a crank set, or a bottom bracket puller, crank puller. And what it does is it screws into the crank itself, and then allows us to use a shaft to push onto the shaft of the bottom bracket, and that will then force the crank to be pulled off. So I'll show you how to use that in just a sec. Okay, so now we need to remove our main bottom bracket axle bolt, which is an 8mm bolt. So we need an 8mm hex key in order to be able to do that. So we insert our hex key and loosen it off. Okay, once it's loosened, using these T-shaped hex keys, these are really handy. You can then simply just loosen that right off easily. Pull the whole thing out, and then we can start removing the crank. Just put that to one side. The next step is we need to use our crank pulling tool, which I showed you earlier, and we need to screw this into the thread that's on the crank, that's pre-threaded on the crank. Right. And again, we need to turn this in a clockwise direction, as you can see, like so. Really important not to cross thread this. I've seen this happen on bikes over the years, and it's a very fine thread, and it's really important not to cross thread it. In this case, a little bit of grease in there just to help that turn might not it might be valuable. Not absolutely necessary, but it should easily turn like that. There shouldn't be any real friction there. So just wind that in right to the end, and then we need to screw in the push bolt. You can do that by hand until it reaches the end. Then grab your 8mm hex key again, insert it into the thread, hold your crank, and just keep turning until the crank is removed. So it's not a difficult exercise. It doesn't require a lot of force. It pulls it off really easily. So once the tension's off it, you can just pull the crank off like so.
Good.
We then can remove our crank pulling tool because we don't need that to reinstall it. So there is the crank removed, and if you've obviously got a new crank, you need to obviously replace that. So in this case, we're looking at a crank that needs to be replaced because it's got a stripped thread on the shaft. In this case, this is perfectly fine, but if you're installing a new one, we'll show you what to do next. Okay, so we're going to reinstall our crank on the right-hand side in this case. So the first thing to do is to check the orientation. So the cranks need to be opposed to each other, 180 degrees opposite. So obviously your left-hand side crank is hanging down, and the right-hand side crank can then be just installed like so. Once the crank's just firmly fitted like that by hand, I like to give it a tap with a rubber mallet. It just seats it onto the spline nicely. You don't have to bash the hell out of it, but just a few light taps like so is all that's required. It just means that's just not going to come off by hand. We can now use the bolt, which we removed earlier, and we always must make sure that we grease the threads on the bolt just to make sure that we get the correct torque when we do the bolt up. So once the bolt's installed just by hand, we can then use our 8mm Allen key to do our bolt up. So screw that in, usually with the ball head first because it's much quicker and easier, until we've got it to the end there. Now we can either do one of two things. If you have a torque wrench and it's the first time you're doing it, I would recommend you do this. So use your torque wrench to do this up to 30 to 40 Newton meters. Now that's pretty tight.
Sorry, what was that? 30 to 40?
30 to 40 Newton meters.
Yep.
So in this case, because I've done this many times, I know what sort of tension that is, and it's pretty firm. It's like you're applying a reasonable amount of force to do that. So from my perspective, that is 30 to 40 Newton meters. Of course, we can check it with the torque wrench. We might even do that as an exercise just to check that the bike's all put together at the end. Once the crank is on, we can then reinstall the chain.
So, what's the reason that you would do the back first and then the
I
front?
just find it easy because then you can actually turn the wheel and the chain just rolls on nicely.
Yeah, good.
Okay. So I automatically went to the front, but to the back, sorry, but it is easier if you put the front on first and then the back. Okay, so now we've got a wheel that's loose in the chainstay, and we've also got a rotor which is very close to the chainstay itself. So we want to make sure that that rotor is not touching the chainstay, really important, and that it's centered between the two chainstays either side. So at this point, you kind of need three hands to do things up. So you've got two bolts to do up, and you've got to try and center the wheel. So the best way to do that, or the way I do it, is using just a simple piece of wooden wedge. And that can be just dropped down in the center of the tire and pressed into place. And what that does is it just puts some tension onto the chain. So as you can see, the chain's nice and firm, it's not loose. And then we can go about just making sure that our wheel is centered in the center of the chainstays and that your rotor's not scraping.
Yeah. So you've got to pay particular attention to where the rotor is.
Yes, you do. So once you've got that centered, you can then double check your chain tension, go back to your 15mm spanner, and then start doing up your nuts just a little bit at a time on both sides. Don't do them up fully on one side and not the other. so that they do them evenly. Just again check that that rotor's not conflicting. Increase your torque onto the nut. This is about 25 Newton meters, not too tight. Okay, now that we've tightened those nuts off, we can then loosen off or remove the wedge. And now our wheel spins freely within the rotor. And we can see it's not touching the chainstay. It's very fine tolerance there, but that's okay, that's fine. Double check our chain tension. Chain tension's nice and tight. That's how it should be. If you want a measurement on that, we can do that. Chain tension is usually measured between the chain stay and the bottom of the chain. So if we put a ruler there and push up firmly with our finger, it's looking at about 30 millimeters gap. 20 to 30 millimeters from the chain stay is perfectly acceptable. We need to reinstall our actuator, which is just done like so. Put it over the top of the push rod, push it over the top of the nut, go back to our 5mm Allen key or a 10mm spanner, and do this up not too tight. Okay, it's very important not to over torque this. I've seen these aluminium casings crack if they're done up too tight. So about 5 Newton meters on that's all that's required, and it'll sit there nicely.
Good.
No issue at all. Okay, we've installed our crank, we've tightened our chain, made sure the adjustment of the rear wheel is accurate and the brake is working effectively. We now want to install the pedal, because remember that we've got, in this case, a cross-threaded pedal, and we want to reinstall a new pedal. So on a pedal, they are marked left and right via a stamp that says
It's hard
L
to see
or
there,
R.
but there's an R on the end
Yep.
of it, so it's a right hand.
Yeah, in this case it's a right-hand pedal.
Okay.
Really important you get that correct. So a right-hand pedal is always on the crank side, on the chain wheel side. And in this case we've got to screw it in clockwise. Sorry, I should also point out, and I have already pre-greased this, but it's very important that grease is applied to the thread. The thread can then be started on the crank, and to make sure that that goes in evenly and smoothly. So I'm just doing that by hand at the moment, and that feels really good. Like, that's easy to turn. You can see I'm just doing it without any effort whatsoever. I can now get hold of my pedal spanner, which is in this case an angled pedal spanner, and we can.
Sorry, where are you applying that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm having trouble tracking you.
Yeah. By turning the crank, it actually screws it in nice and quickly and easily. Once we get to the end of the thread, we can then torque it up. So that's where this angled spanner works really well. So just on the bottom of the pedal stroke there, we can just do that up nice and firmly. Not too tight, just firmly. Okay? You don't want to overdo it, otherwise you might strip it out. So now we've installed the crank and the pedal. We've greased the threads. We've tensioned up the chain. We've centered the back wheel, and we're right to go. The next step is to, we can double check our torque. So I'll show you how to do that with a torque wrench in a minute, and take it for a test ride. And as I said before, after at least a week's worth of riding, maybe less, this chain will need to be retensioned. Okay, what we're going to do is just double check our torque on the axle nut, or axle bolt as it is in this case. And as I said to you before, having done this many times, I've put what I believe to be 30 to 40 Newton meters in there. So we just want to double check that with an accurate torque wrench. So a wrench like this, we've preset that, as you can hopefully see, to 30 Newton meters. And we're just going to double check that it clicks off before, well, at least it clicks off. Once it's clicked off, we know it has met at least 30 Newton meters or more. So that's just a matter of inserting your torque wrench You're going to have to apply a bit of pressure here because it's actually quite tight, and push down, and you can hear it click. So that means that it's a minimum of 30 Newton meters. It's possibly more. If you want to double check it, put it up to say 35. We'll do the same exercise. So we've got 35. Yeah, so it's somewhere in between 30 and 35, and that's all that's required.